around the issue of reproducibility of data, the experimental protocols and the experiments for GMOs have been notorious among scientists for not being able to necessarily get hold of the seeds to redo the experiments, and to get the level of detail on what happened in these experiments. And it's interesting that I think Canada has some of the most restrictive laws when it comes to this sort of confidential business information in this area. Like I say, the US tells us a little more about what they've been looking at. And if you look at the whole European regulatory model, Monsanto, these dossiers send 1,000 or more pages to the regulatory agencies. And in the European regulatory model, if it goes through the specific countries, then it often goes out to a network of scientists who take part in evaluating that data. And we don't have that same level of outside independent input into the process here in Canada. Finally, I think it is worth noting that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, on this decision to reduce the refuge requirements, did say that this is only a conditional authorization, and that they want the companies to assess whether insect resistance, for example, is developing more quickly, or what the effects are, and to come back with the information. And Canada hasn't done a lot of that, and so it's worth patting them on the back on that decision, because hopefully it will mean that there's more concerted effort on the part of the companies to monitor what's going to be happening in the field and come back to the CFIA after a couple of years. But of course, it does depend on the industry doing the monitoring. I don't know if I have time. No, I don't have time. Of course, one of my sort of more fundamental concerns is the whole question of how this is going to impact how new products are impacting farmers in a variety of ways, whether it's the intellectual property regimes associated with biotech crops, or the fact that we're approving or potentially approving some crops in Canada that are then rejected elsewhere in the world and putting our farmers at risk. Back when the Roundup Ready wheat decision was, when our regulators were looking at Roundup Ready wheat, there was huge concern among Canadian farmers about should this be approved, even if very few people decided to grow this product. The buyers, European, South Korean, and Japanese buyers, were all saying if there's any hint of Roundup Ready wheat in those shipments, or if there's a risk of it, we're going to not buy Canadian wheat anymore. And that's a multi-billion-dollar industry, as you know. And the Canadian government was frankly paralyzed. The civil servants just didn't know. They knew they didn't want the product out there, but they were having a hard time figuring out what's a way that we can actually stop this product without putting in, without harming our industry in other ways. Recently, we had the case of Canadian flax. It was discovered there was sort of an unintended, approved but not meant to be registered variety of GM flax that was found in shipments in Europe. The flax price went through the floor. Canadian flax farmers were hugely affected by that. And it raises the question, when it comes to Canadian SmartStax corn growers, if growers opt to be using this coming year, and if, as Michael says, other countries are assuming the Codex guidelines that require more detailed assessments are kind of a minimum standard, then does that put Canadian growers at risk when we have this product approved at a lower standard? So just to conclude, I'd say with Health Canada, the guidelines for the safety assessment of novel foods governing Health Canada in this area are preventing the regulators from doing their job properly. I know that there are people within Health Canada who would like to be looking at these products and with a certain level of detail and saying this is safe or not safe, and they're not getting to do that job. The Royal Society of Canada expert panel recommendations on substantial equivalence are not being followed, obviously, with this product. At the CFIA, there's problems of transparency, peer input, data reproducibility, and we have these issues of confidential business information, which, again, is not the CFIA's fault. That's not Health Canada's fault, but that's a larger issue that I think we need to deal with in Canada. And I think, following on what Michael was saying, I think Canada should see the Codex Alimentarius guidelines as minimum international standards and really develop a regulatory system that meets them. And I think we should also incorporate an assessment of socioeconomic considerations into variety registration, or our farmers stand to lose again. Thank you very much.
So we welcome your questions, specifically on SmartStax and genetically modified crops and foods. We won't entertain other questions. Yeah, so certainly there are 2 mics in the aisles. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to ask your questions of clarification as well.
We talked about the socioeconomic considerations of SmartStax, the health considerations. I'd like to, maybe if we could touch on the environmental considerations. I'd like to further understand, because if my understanding is right about this SmartStax, it's genetically modified now so that we can spray it with Roundup Ready herbicides and it will resist that, but at the same time it's genetically modified to actually produce pesticide. So what's the effect of the production of this pesticide as well in terms of, for example, the soil, the living organisms in the soil, or for insects that would be affected by that?
Yeah, to answer that question, at least in the U.S., and I'm sure they probably looked at it here in Canada, when they approved the initial products, I'm sure what they did is, at least in the U.S., you would have to look at the impact of the cry proteins on various non-target organisms. There are some indicator organisms they use from the soil, but there's others that have pointed out that that's not sufficient. And I should also say, in terms of the refuge requirement, I didn't talk about it, but there is a paper that was published earlier this year by Dr. Bruce Tabashnik that has found that Cry1 and Cry2 proteins, when they're together, they can actually lead to cross-resistance that's asymmetrical. And this was something that was not expected. And so he was one of the scientists that had written comments and thought that the U.S. EPA shouldn't have allowed this reduced level of refuge requirement because it was basically based on theoretical analysis and not based on laboratory studies.
In Germany, Professor Katz from University of Vienna also did some tests with cry proteins on bees. His specialty is bees. And he had done some tests and could not find, looking at the laboratory strain, could not find any impacts at all of BT on the bees. And then he thought, like, hold it, what we have as the test animals here are bees that are basically living and have been brought up in a sterile environment. That means they don't have any germs, they don't have any parasite, they don't have any pathogens. They are just like a clean slate, which is not what is out there. So he said, like, if I really want to know what happens to bees, I probably should have bees that are like the ones out there, which have some parasites, they have some pathogens that are impacted by the environment. And he tested that. And that is when he could actually find that bees were impacted by BT. And he concluded that BT, therefore, has to be considered as a contributor to, for example, in some areas of the collapse, what's it called, of the colony collapse disorder. And I think we need to think of that in a number of cases that, as I mentioned earlier, like what do we use either as the comparator or what do we use as the study object? And is that reflecting the reality?